Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. A bit of a different video today, but I couldn't help but share this because I just stumbled upon some of the most insane research I've ever seen about the happiness levels and biological differences between conservatives and liberals, which, as the kids say these days, is big if true. And not just big as in mind-blowing, but big in the way that it should completely change our political approach and perspective if true. And no, this is not some I fucking love science article or a Daily Mail piece clickbaiting about a recent study that contradicts last week's recent study. This is a very well-sourced analysis from the American Affairs Journal by Musa Al-Gharbi called How to Understand the Well-Being Gap Between Liberals and Conservatives. I adore long-form content like this because it goes well beyond stupid analysis like liberals are less happy because they're stupid and wrong, that are great right-wing circle jerk content for clicks, but leave you understanding the world less than you did before. And instead, the piece really dives into the complexities at play here, even getting into, as I said, biology. That's right, without a doubt, the most terrifying component of this piece is the author highlighting data that shows our politics may not be a result of our own minds, but instead that of your genetics. Left and right being predetermined by one's DNA. And worse, the real nail in the coffin for this analysis, research suggesting that attempts to combat or educate people out of their biological politics just drives them further into their respective genetic corners. Trust me, when I was going through this piece the other night, I was just being mind blown, completely glued to my screen. So if you are capable and haven't ruined your attention span from Instagram Reels and TikTok, do stick around to the end of the video. But first, before we dive into it all, a huge thank you to today's sponsor, Noble Gold. Noble Gold Investments have made it their mission to stay on top of the most important economic news. 3 bank runs in the last month. These are the second largest and third largest runs in history. The government is taking steps to guarantee all deposits, but that just means more money printing. Plus, the Fed is sitting on unrealized losses of $1.2 trillion on their $8.3 trillion bond portfolio. And the Fed will continue to raise interest rates even if they tank the economy. Do you know who are the only ones not afraid? Those invested in precious metals with Noble Gold Investments. Gold is the most stable asset outside of any government control. Hurry and go to noblegoldinvestments.com to secure your wealth now. And bag a free 5-ounce America the Beautiful coin with each gold or silver IRA if you qualify. Visit noblegoldinvestments.com. That's noblegoldinvestments.com. Welcome back. Okay, so for the sake of intellectual responsibility, I do want to note, make a few caveats here before diving into the data. All data is just that, data. The information in this report is very well analyzed, but book reports and stats on anything are not a guide for life or a one-to-one comparison to reality. Many of you know I am a reality supremacist. I think it is incredibly stupid when people don't believe the things they see around them unless a peer-reviewed paper tells them to, or vice versa. They reject things around them because it doesn't line up with the data they saw online. Nothing will ever be more cringeworthy to watch than when you're talking to a real person in front of you, telling you about their life, and you just swat away their entire lived experience as not worth your consideration because, well, they're the exception to some stat you saw online. It is simply impossible for researchers to encapsulate all the complexities of the human experience into simple boxes, and you will have a lot of trouble navigating the world if you think numbers explain it all. That being said, studies still offer us interesting insights to further our understanding of the real world, especially when there seems to be some parallels there. And I do think that's the case with the analysis I'm about to go through today, so let's jump right into it. It has been observed for ages in data that there is a consistent happiness and meaning gap between liberals and conservatives. Particularly one study highlighted in this piece shows a significant uptick in depression amongst liberal teens in 2012. and 3 years later, a similar spike in conservative teens that eventually tapered out while liberals continued on their depression train. While the author of the American Affairs piece has a theory that woke culture caused this uptick, that still didn't answer the question of why, in general, liberals are less happy even before this. So the author started asking, why are conservatives more happy? One simple answer was that patriotism, family, marriage, and religiosity are more conservative values and are all linked to higher levels of happiness. And a lot of people I know would say, well, of course it's things like the God factor, that connection to a higher power and purpose that gives conservatives a higher mood in general. But apparently that is not actually the case here, as independent of religious beliefs, even when measured on actual church attendance, liberals still were roughly twice as likely to report mental illness as conservatives. So a lot of researchers decided to start looking at this from different angles and thought, what if we looked at this the other way around? You know, perhaps this is the result of a chicken and the egg problem. It isn't conservatism that's making these people happy, it's the happiness that's making them conservative. Of course, conservatives want to conserve the current world order because it benefits the positions they were born into. It respects wealth, family values, conventional attractiveness, all things that conservatives on average are more likely to fall into. They're literally more likely to be attractive than liberals based on data. Whereas perhaps if they were born with a different set of cards, they'd have a perspective shift there. And the reason they can't see the other perspective is because they don't want to admit that their conservatism comes from the result of systemic privilege. It's a good theory, however, it kind of falls flat when you consider the fact that ethnic minorities and immigrants, who tend to lean a bit more conservative, are also significantly less likely to be diagnosed with depression compared to their white liberal peers, despite being poorer on average. Not only this, but the wealthier and more educated a liberal is, the more likely they are to be depressed. So what the hell is really going on here? The paper points out that it can be difficult to find good research on this given the fact that social researchers lean liberal over conservative at a ratio of more than 10-1, meaning these explanations of conservatives simply having unacknowledged privilege, lack of self-awareness, and lack of empathy tend to be the go-to explanation when observing this data, whereas little work focuses on how liberal ideology itself may contribute to unfortunate patterns of cognition or behavior or adverse state of affairs. Really gets the noggin jogging. Really makes you wonder if telling all those conservative kids not to go to university and not to get into social sciences wasn't the best idea, because it sure sounds like the world could use a few of them. Now, here's where things get a little spicy. The author highlights there's actually evidence that exists showing individuals' ideological and moral dispositions are biology-based and heritable to a significant degree. According to The Science, around 40% of your political ideology is heritable, which, if you subscribe to the classically liberal blank slate theory, has huge consequences to the entire operation of society as a whole, and especially the sphere I am in: politics. If this is true, then the approach of just trying to make as many logical arguments as possible to win over a political opponent seems like a bit of a waste of time, if this is biological and genetic rather than intellectual, especially considering the article highlights this. One might hope that cultural interventions such as education could help people transcend biological difference and approach common ground. However, the opposite seems true. Cognitive sophistication reinforces and exacerbates intrinsic differences rather than reducing them. This is an idea I don't really want to accept or think about, but if I do, I reckon that this is actually extra true in a world like ours today, where we can find any sort of data or content we want online to reaffirm the things we already want to believe, and where any sort of disagreement is perceived as some sort of intrinsic moral threat to our lives and existence. This is just what we see playing out in the world today, constantly. And of course, if being liberal is in fact a genetic predisposition, well, as the author states, it could be that the observed correlation between liberalism and mental illness is a product of some common set of biological or genetic factors that simultaneously predispose some people to both liberal worldviews and depression and anxiety, even as they dispose others towards conservatism and mental well-being. This stuff really isn't that far off from the theories of those like Jordan Peterson, who dedicates large portions of his work to analyzing the heritable personality traits of different political factions. In fact, I think that's really what we're looking at here. Because what is politics if not an expression of how you approach the world? I don't think anyone believes that fetuses are slapped with a political party pin before they even pop out of their mother's womb. However, how much you value conscientiousness, security, conformity, openness, order, novelty, change, minimizing harm to others, fairness, and even how perceptible you are to feeling disgusted all seem to have a basis in genetics. All of the traits that I just mentioned can be dramatically seen to be different in conservatives versus liberals. Now, like most biological predispositions, they are in fact impacted, exacerbated, and muted to a degree by environmental factors. For instance, there is some evidence that children who are maladjusted, angry, aggressive, otherwise antisocial, are more likely to align themselves with left-wing parties as adults. Other studies have found that people who experienced abuse, insecurity, and trauma as children were much more likely to identify as liberal as adults. These populations are also especially likely to report mental illness as adults. Perhaps the greater question to ask here is not, are your political beliefs based on biology and genetics, but instead, are your political beliefs something that you can truly control? As regardless of whether you have, say, a higher sensitivity to injustice just because you have ADHD, which I just found out is apparently a real thing the other day, or because you experienced extremely unfair situations as a child, the end result still seems to be the same. Lauren, you might say, what about the cases of conservative parents who have liberal children, or vice versa? Well, that's a very fair point. One obvious response to this is that perhaps those environmental factors outweighed the biological factors in that instance, which is entirely possible, but we've already addressed that. So I think the more interesting response is to point to the nuance that simply cannot be reflected in overall studies like this that divide everything into liberals do this and conservatives think that boxes. First of all, you and I both know there are far more different ideologies running about these days than left and right. What about libertarians or totalitarian communists? The complexity of real life means that it is very hard to sort everything into a binary. Putting that aside for a moment, let's take a look at a hypothetical example of a parent and a child. Let's say that the parent is a boomer and they're very classically liberal, you could say, and their millennial child is based and red-pilled. Perhaps you could say on first glance, these two people that are related to one another have completely different views. But it's entirely possible, and in fact likely, as we've seen, that they actually share the same values and predispositions, although having lived through completely different political times, they express those values in different ways. Again, let's use that justice sensitivity example I mentioned earlier. If you grew up seeing Jim Crow laws in America, that could make you a very anti-racist liberal activist. But if you grew up seeing anti-white policies and you were in school being told you're horrible for being born with white skin, well, that could turn you into a bit of a reactionary. You're basically having the same reaction just to a different information input. Of course, I'm simplifying it here, but it makes sense, doesn't it? To me, this seems like a neat explanation for those outliers you will inevitably come across. Now, as I mentioned at the start, all this stuff is just analyzing trends and theories, and there could always be factors we are missing. However, if this is true, and our political predispositions to be conservative or liberal are based strongly on things out of our control, including biology, and having intellectual discussions over it actually exacerbates our disagreements and pushes us further into our own ideological camps, that's quite a problem to have, isn't it? And honestly, I've got to say, reality seems to line up with this theory quite well. I mean, when I was younger, people were far less politically engaged, and they seemed a hell of a lot happier and more likely to accept political differences. And I guess because the internet and social media had not grown to the level it has today, people were just less engaged on average. I'm not saying massive political division and growing extremism has not existed in history, of course it has, but it has definitely been exacerbated by more people joining the online debate and engaging cognitively with these ideas. We are certainly not coming together more. Now, why would it be that more education on politics and more engagement with the topics leads to more division and not, connection? Well, one reason is when given plenty of time to theorize about these ideas, rather than learning with a blank slate, we have inherent biases we subconsciously try to affirm. And if we are highly intelligent, we can create all sorts of mental traps and structures to eternally self-affirm those ideas while infinitely demonizing our political enemies. You've got all of these structures on the left. Racism equals power plus prejudice. Don't tolerate the intolerant. All of these ideas that keep them locked into their own circle. I mean, even operating in the conservative sphere, I've had people frustrated with me for presenting factual information that contradicts the standard right-leaning narrative, and they'll say things like, well, Lauren, even if that is true, it doesn't help us reach the political goals that we're striving for, so it's better to just not highlight that information. Well, that's just another wall we're building up to ensure there's no consideration of the other ideological side, and I don't like that. Really, the most important thing I took away from this work, though, is that the reality conservatives and liberals live in, the ways in which they engage with the world, may as well be entirely different realities. I think this is why the debate world is just entirely collapsed in itself, because we are not having intellectual disagreements. In some cases, we are processing information using entirely different parts of our minds, some more emotional, others more practical, more empathetic, others more critical and paranoid, and interpreting reality through the lens of our trauma, childhoods, and genetic predispositions. And when we do not take the emotional language of our political opponents into account, we don't just cease to communicate to them altogether, we actually reinforce their positions and paranoia. It's incredibly easy to communicate to people like you guys, who I tend to already agree with. We get along, you hear me out, you get the way that I present ideas, right? And perhaps that's some people's only goals, banding together like-minded individuals. It's also incredibly easy to build media empires on doing this. What is difficult to do is to find ways within the human language, spirit, and experience to connect with those who are living in different realities, to find points of familiarity that we can use to build bridges between realms. I don't know, guys. I spend a lot of time thinking about this, thinking about the times I have failed to understand others' ideas when explained to me within a intellectual or verbal context, but then have had them appear to me so clearly when I've encountered them through real-life experience, or the many times people have failed to understand my ideas, the people who have misinterpreted them, and at times I've failed to understand their often hysterical reactions. I'm less offended by it now. I don't take it as personally as I used to, because I know they are processing information using a very different operating system than my own. And I'm less interested in hating other people for having perspectives I find inaccurate, and far more interested these days in wondering how I can perhaps reach out to them, how they can learn from me and I from them, and people much smarter than me. Learning to communicate to these different realms that exist within people's minds is the only way forward. I truly believe that. We have to fight to overcome the fact that our internal biology, our personalities, our traumas, and environments have fractured us into a total inability to communicate and understand one another. While we may be emotional creatures, we are still the only animal on the planet that even has a chance at beginning to master our instincts and try our best to self-reflect, rising out of the mud from which we came to become more than just mere beasts. That was going to be the end of this video, but I don't know. I sat and I thought about it, and today I think I am going to share the paragraphs I cut out. I usually have a few I cut out from my videos because I just think, that might be a bit much, Lauren. You should at least stay within the realm of what is normal to talk about in politics. But I don't know, this time I don't actually think for a minute I agree with my conclusion there. I don't think we as humans are capable of overcoming these instincts, at least not without God. I do not say this as any sort of Christian authority, by the way. I have a lot of trouble even identifying myself as a Christian because I think I have so much work to do there in actually practicing the faith. So what I would say is these are just the words of an honest sinner, the thoughts of an honest sinner, okay? If you think back to the biblical Tower of Babel, we have always been trying to reach heaven on earth. We are trying to create a perfect political system that leads to happiness and peace for us all. So a heavenly state, at least that's what each political ideology purports to want to do. Yet, much like the tower in the Bible, In our sin, our human brokenness, our ego, we have been fractured into a million different languages, which result in our construction repeatedly being set back by the chaos of misunderstanding. Every ideology working its own demise or the other's demise, right? In this case, it's not a verbal language chaos like that in the Bible, but a chaos of the soul, our internal biology, our personalities, our traumas, and environments that have fractured us into total inability to communicate and understand one another. And I'm just at the point in my life where I've realized heaven, or the perfect politics, cannot be created on earth through the intelligence of man, nor by building a very high building that we climb up. And this is just my personal opinion, but I think this must be done through Christ-like behavior, a genuine desire to love and understand one another with our own selfish and temporal desires set aside. Or we can just continue in the chaos of the culture wars that never speak each other's languages and eternally butt heads into ever more and more extremism and misunderstanding, which is probably what we'll do, to be honest. But we don't have to do that in our own lives. We don't have to do that with the people we love or the people we meet on a day-to-day basis, which is why I advocate reality supremacy, community, people directly in front of you, supremacy. You can create those bridges, you can create that beauty in your own life. I am a total optimist for every single one of you watching this channel, and an optimist for my own life, just not for the world. That shit's over. That's done. But you guys, we're gonna be okay. We're gonna be okay. All right. Thanks for watching this video. Bye, guys.